Good afternoon, everybody. Once again, it's a privilege to be able to talk to the class of 2024. Every November for the past 20 years, I've had the opportunity to address those students involved in SJC 100, a course that I think is supposed to empower you to make a positive transition to the school and learning community of St. Joseph's College. I've been privileged to be a part from the beginning of the formation of this class, and I have really valued my opportunity, not only of teaching students through the lens of social science, specifically sociology, which is my area of expertise, but also to be able to be a part of the annual wellness presentation. As you think about your classes, for me this is awkward because it's the first time in 20 years that I'm not looking out at your faces. And I'm sure many of you are probably not happy that you have to even look at this video. But hopefully, the few things that I'd like to share with you might cause you to think about how blessed you are, think about the human connections that you share with each other, and realize that all of us are called to become the best version of ourselves and truly realize and recognize, no matter what your major, no matter what your social group, no matter what your economic situation, that we all have the power to make a difference. I became a Montfort missionary Roman Catholic priest 41 years ago because I wanted to work with the poor. I grew up in a traditional, old-fashioned Irish-Italian Catholic family, the oldest of 5 children, born in Brooklyn, and then we migrated to Massapequa. I went to the public and parochial schools in that community, and then in the 70s, went to St. John's University. It was there that I felt God was calling me to do more with my life. And because of my desire to work with the poor, I became a Montfort missionary. My first assignment as a Montfort missionary was to work in Washington, D.C. I became the building principal of an inner city school that was abandoned by white flight after the riots in that city. It was a school that didn't have very much economically and socially, but there was a spirit of community, a spirit of solidarity, especially among the students, that inspired me. So much did it inspire me that I thought maybe this is where God was calling me, to stay here in the inner city. So in the late 70s, when my religious superior came to me and said, "We'd like to transfer you," I was a little uneasy about the thought of a transfer unless I would have the opportunity to go to the third world. And the Montfort missionaries have a mission in Nicaragua. But when they asked me to go to Port Jefferson, Long Island, I didn't even know where Port Jefferson was on the map. Growing up in Massapequa, I didn't think anybody lived east of Amityville. So I looked it up on the map, and I realized that it was a pretty affluent community with lots of resources. So I said to the person who was in charge at the time that I thought that wouldn't be the best use of my talents. I was young. He let me go on for about 40 minutes. Then he said, "Thank you, Father. Thank you for your input. But you'll go to Port Jefferson, you'll like going to Port Jefferson, and if you know what's good for you, you'll do a good job in Port Jefferson." Well, I've lived in Port Jefferson for 41 years. I don't regret one day, 1 hour, 1 month, 1 year of those 41 years, because every year has been a blessing and an experience of change and transformation that has enriched me as a person and hopefully empowered me to continue to grow on the journey and becoming the best version of myself. I went there as the parish priest to be in charge of the struggling elementary school. Being the youngest person in the house, I covered 2 hospitals at night as the chaplain. And that was my baptism of fire that totally changed me forever. In my first 6 months, I buried 9 young people who died because of recklessness, because of drug overdoses, because of car accidents due to alcohol, and a whole host of other things. But I didn't just come into the emergency room after the fact. I came in as the ambulance was arriving. As a young priest in my 20s, I saw decapitation. I met with grieving families that were shocked to have to see their son or daughter who overdosed and had a needle in his or her arm. Those experiences really caused me to step back and really examine, what am I doing with my life? Am I really making a difference? Then I started to think about poverty, that I wanted to work with the poor. And I realized that the definition of poverty that I came to Port Jefferson with 41 years ago was based on a traditional definition that you find in social science that I teach. Economic deprivation, not having the material resources to make things work. Well, I discovered in Port Jefferson that it was a different kind of poverty that was much more destructive and debilitating than the poverty of economics. It was the poverty of spirituality. It was the poverty of compassion and care and concern for others. It was a poverty that was paralyzing people and fueling the drug and alcohol and suicide epidemic that at 41 years later is still a problem. And there was one particular circumstance that forced me to live my life differently. I received a letter from a young man that I was working with in my capacity as a social worker in my first year there. And this is what he had to say. Dear Father Frank, please read this letter very carefully. Father, as you know, I've had many problems and sadnesses in the past. You also know that I've been fighting with myself over problems of loneliness and not being loved. I've come to rely on you for strength and guidance, but most of all for the reassurance that my life must go on. Father, you also know that I tend to give up on most things, including relationships, if they didn't work out. I've given up on a lot of things, my family life, for one, my belief in God, and myself. I'm a very sensitive and emotional person. All things affect me in some way. A whisper or a snicker as I walk by, the instant quiet as I enter a room, a comment that unknown to others pertains to me. These things and others hurt the most, as well as being ignored by the people I thought were my friends. Giving up things is natural to me. I've done it so often. I've given up almost all that I have, except the dream of ending all the pain and sorrow that I feel and have felt in the past. The pain that burns deep inside me, the pain that can't be lifted, not even in death, a pain that comes from years of grief and sorrow, great pain, years of misery that seem unending. Pain has become my best friend. Not many people have gotten close to me. Not many have wanted to. I know all the tricks to keeping the people that I want out, and letting the ones I want in. You're one of those persons I can't keep out because you're already in, and I'm glad. But this is something I have to do. I can't handle the pain any longer. I'm sorry, but I must. I hope you, as well as God, can forgive me. Sincerely, Mike. Mike's parents found this letter in his social studies book 2 hours after Mike hung himself. Mike was 15. He was a sophomore in a local high school on the North Shore. By everybody's definition, he had it all together. He was a scholar athlete, had a nice circle of friends, but obviously those that were closest to him did not realize how much pain he was living with every day. You know, when someone takes their life, they don't want life to be over. They want the pain and the hurt to stop. We gather for this wellness presentation, realizing that in our midst, in all of our classes, out of the 500 freshmen in this year's class, there are potential Mikes. Guys and girls that wear the plastic smile, say all the right things, do all the right things, but inside they're dying. We need to develop the eyes to see beyond those facades that we all hide behind and realize that sometimes just a kind word, a hand in friendship, to be included when someone seems to be sitting on the outside could make all the difference in someone's life. I say yes to this presentation every year because I believe most of you who are watching today really do care. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that you become a holy roller or a goody two-shoes. But if you really value friendship, then be a good friend. Have those hard conversations. Reach out even though at times you don't want to, because life is hard for all of us. And recognize that in your reaching out, you might be saving a life. Mike's death changed me forever. I shared this letter at a youth mass that I did in 1980. After that mass, a group of juniors and seniors in high school waited for me. And they wanted to thank me for always challenging them and always reminding them of what's really important in terms of the Christian journey. Then a senior guy that I knew very well said to me, "You know, it's great that you challenge us, Father." And then he said this, which I will never forget. It's etched in my heart. And so what is the church doing to address all of these social concerns that you often speak to? You know, I couldn't respond to him because at that moment, I didn't feel the church was doing much of anything. I went back to the rectory that I was living in at the time, and it was a very restless night for me because that young man really challenged me to think about what was I doing with my life to make things better. Yeah, it's great to get up and give a great homily or come to St. Joe's and present a dynamic class, but that's tip of the iceberg. What am I doing to try to improve the quality of life and where I live and with the people that I work with? Because of the things that were happening in 1980, I decided after that challenge to have a community meeting. I'm trained as a community organizer, and I wanted to talk about some of the social concerns in our community. I was young. Some of the people that were senior by 20 years to me said, "Oh, you're wasting your time, no one's going to come." 150 people showed up that night. And we talked about the drug and alcohol problem that even existed in 1980. We talked about the suicide that were happening, that people were pretending weren't happening. And from that meeting, a group gathered with me, and it gave birth to today what is Hope House Ministries, a ministry of social outreach and residential care for young people at risk, for families that are struggling, for the homeless, for those that need mental health services, for women who are abused and have no safe place to live. The catalyst after that meeting was another experience that I had that year. I was asked to speak and offer the prayer at graduation at Port Jefferson High School. I knew 150 graduates. I knew all of them by name. Even though most of them were in Catholic, most of them plugged into the social programs that I sponsored. It was a great celebration. I was really honored to be a part of it. That night I was on duty at Mather Hospital. I got a phone call that there was an emergency, that they needed a priest right away. I was a little uneasy with that phone call because it was graduation night, and I was fearful at one of the graduation parties something might have happened. The drinking age was still 18. I got up to the emergency room. It was about midnight. There were a couple of cop cars and all kinds of kids outside yelling and screaming. I made my way to the desk, and the charge nurse said, "Father Pizzarelli, can you please go into this holding room?" I went into this very dimly lit holding room, and on a table underneath the white sheet was the body of a 17-year-old boy. He had already died. His arm was severed from its shoulder. I said the prayers that you pray when someone has died, and I very quickly pulled that sheet back over his body. I was overwhelmed at what I saw. I knew him by name. All I wanted to do was go home. As I was about to leave, the charge nurse came to me and said, "Everybody's upset about this boy's passing. Could you do us a favor and call his parents?" I don't want to call his parents. How do you tell the mother of a 17-year-old boy who had everything to live for that he's dead, laying on a table in pieces? But that was my job. I was the priest. So I got the mother on the telephone. I didn't have a heart to tell her that her boy had already passed away. I just said that Jack was in a very serious car accident and that it was really imperative that she come immediately to the emergency room. About 20 minutes later, this middle-aged mom walked in, all upset and disheveled looking. I went up, I introduced myself, went into a little conference room. She sat in front of me. And then I proceeded to do the most painful thing I've ever done in my adult life. I had to tell that mother that her 17-year-old boy was dead. Needless to say, she got hysterical, and she started to sob. And in between her sobbing, she asked me the one thing I was praying she wouldn't ask. She asked if she could go into that holding room to see her boy one more time. I couldn't tell her no. How could I tell you no if you were in an accident on the way home from a party and your best friend got killed at that accident and you went to the emergency room of the nearest hospital and you just wanted to see your friend one more time? Well, I couldn't say no to that mother, and I didn't. And I took her by the hand, and I took her up to the table where her boy was laying. And I watched that mom bend down, and I watched her pull the sheet off of his body. She put her arms underneath him with the blood still oozing out of him. She started to hug and kiss him, and she was crying. And then she looked up at me and she said, "Father Frank, why my son?" I said to myself, why her son also? How come there was nobody at that party that realized that Jack was out of control, that didn't reach out to him and grab his keys and block him from leaving the house? After that, Mom saw her son. She needed to tell me what had happened that night. Jack had asked 2 days before graduation if he could have a graduation party. Jack was the oldest of 4. She had never had a teenage party in her life. Jack assured her it'd be just a couple of friends, no big deal. Well, most of us know that it never is just a couple of friends. Whenever there's a party, everybody and their brother come, whether they're invited or not. Over 200 kids showed up at Jack's house. The kegs of beer were there, hard liquor was snuck in, people were smoking weed. The woman was horrified and overwhelmed. She finally confronted Jack after 3 of his friends got sick in her living room. And really, they had a confrontation. He became so angry with his mother that he stormed out under the influence, got into the brand new car he got for graduation, and coming out of Mount Sinai into Port Jefferson on North Country Road, there's a big dip in the road. Doing 80, he lost control of that car, went up the embankment, hit a tree, and went right through the windshield of his car. That's where the ambulance people found his broken body. After she shared all of that, I couldn't help but feel like my heart was going to break for this mother. And I realized that we need to do something more to help people be more attentive. Not make people holy rollers, not saying don't have a good time or have a party, but to raise people's awareness to be more conscious that we need to take care of ourselves. 3 days after Jack was killed, I presided at his funeral. The Church of Infant Jesus on Main Street in Port Jefferson was packed to overflowing. Big strapping football players, Jack played football, passed by his body, broke down and sobbed. Girls came up and put bouquets of flowers on his casket. I looked out at that community and they were numb. They were overwhelmed. Jack was a good guy. rarely ever made poor choices. But that night he did. And as I stood before them, I challenged them. I said, if you really loved Jack, if he was really your friend, then why this? Why couldn't someone reach out and protect Jack from Jack? There is a saying that most of you know, friends don't let friends drive drunk. Well, obviously Jack didn't have a friend that night, because if he did, maybe we wouldn't have gathered for his funeral. That happened in 1980. That was the straw that broke the camel's back and pushed me to do something more, and specifically gave birth to the first Hope House, which was located in Mount Sinai and has since relocated there after 38 years. Since that tragic day, I have buried more than 400 young people who have died senselessly because of suicide, because of drugs, alcohol, and violence. As I bury each one of them, I bury a part of myself, because I say to myself, what could I have done differently that might have contributed to protecting Jack's life? Normally, at this point in my presentation, I would ask all of the sections to have a couple of students volunteer and come and stand in front of the auditorium stage. And then I would ask them to step outside their comfort zone, and I'd ask them to join hands. I've never had a class laugh or make fun of the people holding hands. But I can tell you that every line for 20 years, those guys and girls standing there representing their freshman class were uncomfortable. And I said to those who were sitting in the audience, as I'm saying to you this afternoon, that line of solidarity is key. People will wax eloquent with lots of stories. None of that's important. But what's important is that unbroken line of solidarity and people willing to stand with human connections and protect each other. I do this every fall semester because I believe every one of you here care about each other. And my hope and prayer for you as we come to the end of this first semester, during these crazy times with the pandemic, with all kinds of social unrest, that instead of that discouraging you, it will empower you to stand strong and realize that you can make a difference. None of us like to be judged by the color of our skin, the length of our hair, the music we listen to. How often, however, do we hide behind all of those things, and we allow those things to block us from doing what's right? These are challenging times. More than 200,000 people have died from a virus that we still do not have any control of. It doesn't know a name or a face or an age, a color or an economic status. It is infectious and out of control. Equally is the opioid epidemic. In the last 3 weeks, I've had, unfortunately, to bury 4 young men with tremendous promise because they overdosed, because there weren't enough treatment services available for them to get help. Never hesitate if there's a friend in your circle of life that you're concerned about. Never be afraid, even if he or she might be mad at you, because that gesture of compassion and kindness might save a life. And no matter where you go or no matter what you do, remember each and every one of you have the power to make a difference that really does count.